Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Anthony Quainton, Washington Theological Consortium Board of Trustees Chair.
Good evening. Welcome to all who are participating in this symposium, to all who are online watching it. This is an important moment in the life of the Theological Consortium, which now has completed 50 years, bringing together theological schools representing a broad diversity of Christian experience: Byzantine and Roman Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, Evangelical, Black and white, across the spectrum of education, designed to bring men and women into their world of theological life and work. At this moment in our history, with our society so deeply divided on so many issues, those men and women called to be priests and pastors and ministers find themselves obliged to engage in the world in ways that perhaps they never had to do before, when their own denominational preoccupations were paramount for them. And so this year, in our 50th year, we are highlighting the need, the desperate need, I would say, of our society for men and women of faith to engage in the world and to provide leadership and understanding and guidance in terms of moral and other precepts, so that we can move forward as a country, as a society, as religious people committed as we are to the message of the Christian faith. But we've gone beyond that in these last years to engage with our Jewish and Muslim brethren, because they too share the vast diversity of our world and of our society, and they too are in the world with which we must engage. And so this evening we have a chance to hear from four very distinguished practitioners of their faiths and hear how they would help us understand how men and women of faith should engage in public life. And it's with great pleasure that I invite you to join in listening to their words, reflecting on their messages, and joining in the call to action which will inevitably come from the messages that they bring to us. Thank you very much for being with us.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Larry Goldman, Washington Theological Consortium Executive Director.
We're delighted that you are with us tonight, and I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists. Our first speaker will be Archbishop Job of Telmessos from the Orthodox Church. He is the Ecumenical Patriarch's representative to the World Council of Churches. And he also is the Dean of the Institute of Graduate Studies of Orthodox Theology and Professor of Liturgical and Dogmatic Theology in Symposium in Geneva. He's author of numerous articles related to liturgical theology, ecumenism, and Orthodox spirituality. Our second speaker is the Right Reverend Mariann Budde, Bishop of the Diocese of Washington of the Episcopal Church, and president of the foundation of the National Cathedral, where she also served previously as interim dean. Prior to her election as bishop, she served for 18 years as rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in Minneapolis. Her sermons have been published in several journals, and she is author of 2 books, Receiving Jesus, The Way of Love, and Gathering Up the Fragments, Preaching as Spiritual Practice. Our third presenter is the Reverend Dr. Gregory Howard, Interim Dean of the Samuel Dewitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia University, where he also serves as Associate Professor of Homiletics and Practical Theology. He has served as President of the Baptist General Convention of Virginia. He's the author of Black Sacred Rhetoric, the Theology and Testimony of Religious Folk Talk. Our fourth presenter is Father Mark Morozowich. He's the Dean of the School of Theology and Religious Studies at Catholic University of America. He was formed in the Ukrainian Catholic Church and is a priest in the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of St. Josaphat in Parma, Ohio. He has served parishes in Pennsylvania. In addition to serving as Dean of the School of Theology, he is an associate professor of liturgy, and his research ranges from penitential practices and the liturgical year to Eastern Christian mysteries. Welcome to our panelists.
Dear participants of the Washington Theological Consortium, Christianity is the religion of incarnation. One of the fundamental points of Orthodox theology is that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Therefore, for us, religion is neither an escape from the body nor an evasion from the world, but on the contrary, Christians await the coming of the Kingdom of God in fullness, remembering that it has been already inaugurated among us. For this reason, Christians ought not to be disinterested in public life, but on the contrary, engaged in public issues. According to the Orthodox tradition, one of the concerns of the Christian should be the transfiguration of our world. As the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church that gathered on the island of Crete in Greece in 2016 stressed in its document on the mission of the Orthodox Church in today's world, and I quote here the document, "The Church as the body of the incarnate Word of God constitutes the living presence as the sign and image of the kingdom of the triune God in history, proclaims the good news of a new creation, of new heavens, and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. News of a world in which God will wipe away every tear from people's eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain." End of the quote. This has been the conviction of the Orthodox Church throughout centuries, and especially these last decades, when she was particularly sensible to the issues of ecology, social justice, and ethical questions. The Orthodox Church was a pioneer in addressing the environmental crisis since the year 1986. This led the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople to take an active part in various international ecological initiatives and to establish the day of September 1st as a day of prayer for the protection of the natural environment in 1989. No other worldwide religious leader has placed the ecological crisis at the forefront of his service and sermons as the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. We are glad that his clear message was heard and taken over by other Orthodox primates, such as the late Patriarch Ignatius of Antioch and the current Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, who have called for the protection of God's creation. Thus, the sensibility of Orthodox theology to the environmental crisis reached a pan-Orthodox consciousness. The message of the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church emphasizes the spiritual and moral causes of the ecological crisis connected with greed, avarice, and egoism, which led to the over-exploitation of natural resources, pollution, and to climate change. For this reason, it states that the Christian response to the problem demands repentance for the abuses, an ascetic frame of mind as an antidote to overconsumption, and at the same time a cultivation of the consciousness that man is a steward and not a possessor of the creation. The Council saw the origin of the problem in a secular approach to the environment, which introduces a rupture between the creation and the Creator. For this reason, As the encyclical reminds us, the approach to the ecological problem presupposes our greatest responsibility to hand down a viable natural environment to future generations and to use it according to the divine will and blessing. This initiative of the Orthodox Church has been very well received by the ecumenical movement and by other Christian churches, as witnessed by Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, published in 2015. Following this major encyclical, Pope Francis, with Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, issued a joint message for the World Day of Prayer for Creation on September 1st, 2017. This message invited all people of goodwill to dedicate a time of prayer for the environment on the 1st of September, stressing that the human environment and the natural environment are deteriorating together, and this deterioration of the planet weighs upon the most vulnerable of its people, and called humanity to care for creation as an invitation for all humanity to work towards sustainable and integral development. Although the Orthodox Church considers that she does not directly involve herself in politics, the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church underlined that human rights today are at the center of politics as a response to the social and political crises and upheavals, and seek to protect the citizen from the arbitrary power of the state, and stated clearly that the Orthodox Church confesses that every human being, regardless of skin color, religion, race, sex, ethnicity, and language, is created in the image and likeness of God and enjoys equal rights in society. The Holy and Great Council also noted that the Church cannot remain indifferent before economic conditions that negatively impact humanity as a whole. For this reason, it made an appeal for a sustainable economy which ought to combine efficiency with justice and social solidarity. The Orthodox Church, throughout centuries, has always promoted a culture of solidarity and treated the persecuted ones, those in danger and in need, on the basis of Christ's command, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these my brethren, you did it for me." This explains that her Holy and Great Council underlined that at no time was the Church's philanthropic work limited merely to circumstantial good deeds toward the needy and suffering, but rather it sought to eradicate the causes which create social problems. Besides the problems we have already mentioned, ethical issues have occupied the public sphere, particularly the question of same-sex marriages and the questions related to the beginning and end of life. The Orthodox Church believes that these issues cannot be dealt exclusively from a political, sociological, or scientific point of view, but should involve also religious and theological principles. As the Holy and Great Council noted in its document on the mission of the Orthodox Church in today's world, and here I quote the document once again, "Over the last years, we observe an immense development in the biological sciences and corresponding biotechnologies. Many of these achievements are considered beneficial for humankind, while others raise ethical dilemmas, and still others are deemed unacceptable. The Orthodox Church believes that the human being is not merely a composition of cells, bones, and organs, nor again is the human person defined solely by biological factors. Man is created in the image of God, and reference to humanity must take place with due respect. The recognition of this fundamental principle leads to the conclusion that both in the process of scientific investigation as well as in the practical application of new discoveries and innovations, we should preserve the absolute right of each individual to be respected and honored at all stages of life. Moreover, we should respect the will of God as manifested through creation. Research must take into account ethical and spiritual principles as well as Christian precepts. Indeed, due respect must be rendered to all of God's creation in regard to both the way humanity treats and science explores it, in accordance to God's commandment. End of the quote. To conclude my brief presentation, I would like to underline that the Orthodox Church has always been in dialogue with the contemporary world, as recently witnessed by her Holy and Great Council, whose aim, of course, was not to solve all the problems of humanity, but rather to give to the world a message of light, a message of consolation, a message of hope. As it has been stated in the conclusion of its message, I quote, "The Holy and Great Council has opened our horizon towards the contemporary diverse and multifarious world. It has emphasized our responsibility in place and in time, ever with the perspective of eternity." Thank you for your attention.
We are grateful to Archbishop Job for a theological framework of incarnation that moves the church and its leaders into environmental issues, human rights, and ethical issues. Bishop Budde is willing. Can we hear from you?
Of course, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me to be part of this gathering of the Washington Theological Consortium. Congratulations on the 50 years. I am in some way a product of the consortium in that while I was a student at Virginia Theological Seminary now over 30 years ago, I took courses through the consortium that were pivotal not only in my education, but in particular in my education and in public life, because it was through the consortium that I actually traveled from the suburban campus of Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, into the city of Washington. And I will say more about that as I make my remarks. I was truly struck by the title of this event, or the title upon which we were invited to reflect, educating public leaders to engage in public life, which made me wonder exactly how are leaders formed. Christian spiritual leaders of any faith, in my case the Christian faith, but others in other traditions, how are we formed as those who choose to serve God in this world, for Christians to serve Jesus and follow his example in this world? How do we move that? How are we inspired or cajoled or convinced that part of that ministry of discipleship and leadership is in the public arena? So first, I think we have to assume that God is indeed present in the public sphere, and that calls those who love and serve God to serve others in the name of God and in the name of our particular faith tradition, for the common good in the public arena. And that's not necessarily where we are called to, for me as a Christian, to make disciples of Jesus in that public arena, but rather to embody the love of God revealed to me in Jesus and revealed in other ways in other faiths, for others and for the good of the world. How does one become formed to serve in public life and to witness to the universal affirmation that all human beings are created in the image of God, that we are called to respect the dignity of every human being and to strive for justice, mercy, and peace among all people? How did that happen for me? How did I watch others being formed and inspired to do this work? And so to frame my remarks tonight, I'd like to actually use a schema that I learned about discipleship in general, faith formation in general, from an author by the name of Andy Stanley, who is the senior pastor of a large church outside of Atlanta, North Point Community Church. And in one of his books on how he created churches that reach people who are not normally part of a religious tradition, he had an entire chapter on formation and his philosophy of formation. And I'm going to use his schema to think of ways we can educate rising leaders into ministry and public life. And what he does in his schema is to say that that God uses certain events and people and opportunities in our life to grow us in faith and love and maturity in that faith and love of God, love of neighbor. He identified 5 catalysts in general, and I'm going to offer these as a framework for our thoughts on public life and theological education. And those 5 are, and I'll do them in greater depth, but let me just name them now. Providential relationships, the people that we meet and encounter that inspire us. Pivotal circumstances, the events in our lives and the lives of others that mark us and change us forever. Third, practical teaching, the teachers that light up the scriptural text for us, that reveal to us something of the heart of God, and that move us toward God, toward love of neighbor, toward service in public life in a particular way by the impact of their teaching upon us. Fourth, a personal ministry, when we ourselves step out in faith and have an experience through ministry that stretches us beyond our comfort, beyond our zone of awareness, into the life experience of another. And then finally, our private devotions, how we integrate all of that, how we bring our experiences into prayer and into spiritual practice on a daily level. And so for theological education, I would suggest that if we looked at those 5 catalysts and built a theological educational program with those 5 catalysts in mind, we would have a better chance. And I, as a bishop, as I think about forming my leaders, I would have a better chance of cultivating public leadership if I paid attention to those five key catalysts. So I'll go through them again, and now through the lens of forming leaders for public life. So the first, providential relationships. Who are the people that you and I have met that have inspired us by their example for public life and public ministry? I was thinking back, who are the people when I was in seminary that inspired me? My classmates, my teachers. I took a course through the consortium at which I met a minister of a Lutheran church in downtown Washington, D.C., who was working alongside people experiencing homelessness. I met those people themselves, and they were inspiring to me. And so I would suggest that we would want to make sure that in our education, we have opportunities for people to form relationships with those who are doing this important work. The second is pivotal circumstances, the events in our lives or in the lives of others that mark us. Chances are, in the course of theological study, there are going to be marking events that we can draw upon to reflect with our students, to reflect ourselves, I with my leaders, on what is God doing in the world. If we think about just in the last few years, obviously the things that just leap out at the page, the global pandemic, racial reckoning, the issues that present themselves, how do we use those circumstances? And more important, how can we, or equally important, how can we encourage each of our theological students, each of my rising leaders, to think theologically about the events of our own lives and what they have to teach us about what God is doing in our lives and in the lives of others. The third, practical teaching. That kind of goes without saying in a theological education context, but who do we want to make sure that our students, who do I want to make sure that my leaders meet, whose teaching can bring alive the importance of this ministry in public life? As a theological student myself, it was sitting in the library of the seminary, and listening to the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. I was a child when Martin Luther King died, so I didn't have that impact. He didn't impact me when he was alive, but as a young adult, as I was in seminary, even in college, he was the one that awakened me through his example in the recorded speeches and his writings when I was forming my own ideas of public leadership. It was also during that time I was in seminary during the Central American Wars, and I was inspired by the teaching and the example of those from the Catholic Church and from others who were literally giving their lives for the sake of the poor in that part of the world. And it was both their teaching and their example that moved me. Personal ministry, opening ourselves to those opportunities that encourage us to stretch and to grow. When I was in seminary, I volunteered at a homeless shelter overnight near downtown Washington. So making sure that we have opportunities for people to travel abroad and to see life through other people's eyes, whatever we can do to stretch us into public arenas so that we expand our imagination, our consciousness, our personal sense of what God is doing in our lives as we engage with others in that realm. And then finally, private devotions. How can I, as a follower of Jesus, as a child of God called to leadership, how do I integrate that into my prayer, to my understanding of Scripture? How do I provide myself with resources? How can others provide me with resources that I can use as tools for my devotion? I've been using of late the devotions of Howard Thurman to anchor me in a posture of deep reflection and service through the lens of another life experience and another time. And I would encourage all of us to think about ways we can inspire and cajole and teach those coming through the institutions of theological education to bring these issues into prayer and to hear what God is saying to them. So those are my thoughts for tonight, to offer those 5 catalysts and to use them as a prism through which we might inspire those who come into our institutions for learning to consider the ways God is moving them into public ministry through providential relationships, pivotal circumstances, practical teaching, personal ministry, and private devotion. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Bishop Budde. We're grateful for that framework, which is so practical and also allows for real personal change. At this time, we turn to our 3rd speaker, and that is Reverend Dr. Gregory Howard.
Good evening, and thank you, Larry, for the introduction. Along with my peers, I trust that we realize that this is good space, safe space for us to share and reflect and glean from one another. I count it a privilege to be a part of this tapestry of theological educators and people of faith. In many ways, we are a contradiction this evening to the emerging culture of the politicization of faith and the people of faith. But we dare to pause and to ponder and offer unto one another perspectives and approaches to ensure that our faith is fully engaging in that of public life. I'm intentionally creating sort of a tension or a dialectic in many ways in the spirit of dialectical preaching, with the hopes of offering recommendation and that which we seek to practice at the School of Theology at Virginia Union. I am a person of faith. I am one who seeks to wed theory and praxis, the substantive and the practical, in that of a theological educator, and a preacher and pastor of a community of faith in Central Virginia. With all that being stated and said, there's an interesting nexus between what the late James Cone's thesis exclaimed as God is on the side of the oppressed, and Jesus's declaration that he has come so that we may have life and have it to the full. This nexus casts light upon even the United States Declaration of Independence's claim of such truth that all people possess the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Furthermore, it demands an ecclesial response to oppression, any hindrance that will negate such pursuit of those inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And I stress oppression of every kind. The realities of racial and gender injustices and our hope for equality as we seek to establish within the Basileia, as Paul exclaimed to the church in Galatia, a community, an ethos, where there's no Jew or Gentile, bond or free or male or female. We are made to deal with this constant anthropological dilemma. And one may assert or suggest that it persists due to the lack of full engagement of the faith of Jesus in the public square or in public life. And even our faith in Jesus in that of public life, imposing or by way of imposition, offering itself to public policy makers, and even a greater impression upon our civic or social responsibility. The Judeo-Christian experience from antiquity to the present age is one that exclaims that we are, as the ancient Hebrews, a minority people struggling to survive, to quote the words of Jerome Clayton Ross. And we find ourselves engaged and enthralled and sometimes circumscribed within a pluralistic and androcentric reality that is perpetuated by many, but certainly by Eurocentric supremacy seeking to maintain privilege. In 2014 in Dallas, Texas, at the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Conference, Frank Thomas shared with us, and I quote, that privilege is our greatest enemy because no one wants to give it up. And I dare say, including people of faith that choose self and communal preservation of a particular race, ethnic group, or social class, vis-a-vis white heterosexual male dominance. The question, therefore, is raised in common vernacular, just as relevant in 2021 as it was in late first century. What would Jesus do? And throughout the global society, tensions among nations and between varied peoples groups, as made evident even here among Black and white and brown faces, and relations that we're still cultivating here in America. The interrogative is, who is David and who is Goliath? Now, as pastor in particular, who serves as resident theologian and cultural creator, one is made to establish agency for the disenfranchised or the oppressed, voice for the voiceless, even at the expense of his or her social, cultural, and economic accoutrements and security, pseudo-security. Now, this is prophetic in that it comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. And I assert that as a seminary in the 21st century, curriculum inclusive of practical theology, and that of social activism and law and politics, ethics and politics, transformative praxis that aims toward freedom, engages seminarians' faith in public life, that we must dare to be intentional in shaping our seminarians as they will reemerge in real life and serve the good of all humanity. So seminary and our courses will prepare or need to prepare our future servants and present day servants within the body of Christ to be professional exegetes of culture, and also those who seek to deconstruct and slay the Goliath who compromises one's inalienable right for life, liberty, and the pursuit for happiness, in spite of race, gender, sexuality, personal economics, orientation, and so forth. Theological reflection, therefore, and education causes us to examine even sacramentality, or the evidence of grace in all creation, which also requires the recognition and even a reversal of the contrary, which is disgrace or the alienation of a particular people. So the pulpit is being trained to find its way to the vocation of policy makers or influencers, educators, and social justice advocates as public witness of the faith of Jesus. In short, we must be, as Dr. John Kennedy defines, convergent type of scholars and practitioners, merging the classical with that of the corner scholar and community sage, with the hope that we will birth a better reality, that we will play a part in shaping and cultivating a better humanity. In the words of my late maternal grandmother, Winnie Blanche Henderson, just treat folk right and fairly, just as you want to be treated. This is what we seek to do in the midst of all of our theological reflection, historical reminiscing, and practical engagement in other disciplines. Our hope is that we will make a better humanity. I shall rest for further engagement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howard. The bond of theory and praxis in your own life is reiterated as an obligation of seminary professors to link scholarship and practice in their own identity, to raise up leaders that can slay the Goliaths of our society and lift up the inalienable rights of all. We turn now to our fourth presenter, Father Mark Morozowich of Catholic University of America.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldman, for inviting me to be part of this. And as well, I want to thank my fellow panelists. It's a bit intimidating to go at the end of the presentation when so many people have raised so many wonderful points and wonder how I can add to this important dialogue as we reflect on educating our religious leaders to engage in public life. You know, it's something that when we think about the very reality of what we're doing in our theological studies, and we take seriously this concept of faith-seeking understanding, taking seriously this role of this relationship to God, this role of prayer, and how it's that operation in our life which leads us to that right action or orthopraxis. Now, I wish that I had a lot longer time here to go through the entire social doctrine of the Catholic Church, especially starting with Rerum Novarum from the 15th of May in 1891, when Pope Leo XIII was addressing the issues on labor and capital, this this theological tradition putting forth the church into the public sphere is something that resonates so well. And especially if we look at the 20th century and the plight of churches, and I thought I would share with you the plight of my own church. As Larry mentioned, I'm a Ukrainian Catholic priest. My grandparents were immigrants to this country. And so hearing the stories of people that I didn't know, and specifically the story of the persecution of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Ukraine, when in 1945, all of the bishops were arrested in our church, numerous priests and lay people imprisoned, sent to Siberia because of the faith. Even in 1946, there was a pseudo-synod in Lviv, which liquidated this church. I come from a reality of people who stick up for their faith, who witness to their faith, who witness to their identity. And I see that all intertwined in that basic and simple reality: prayer leading to transformation. Now, as you can see, this beautiful iconostasis behind of me, it's not simply something that makes our eyes happy, but it reminds us of that right image of God. And my fellow Ukrainians and Ukrainian Catholics in 2014 were on the Maidan in Kyiv, a demonstration that began already in the 21st of November 2013 and stretched until 23rd of February in 2014, when they were witnessing to their dignity. Churches set up little chapels to walk with people. And I think that that's so important. That's the very epitome of how our faith leads to that engagement in public sphere, and what I believe that we're trying to do in our own task of educating religious leaders for tomorrow. Now, if we think about this focus on human dignity, I just thought I'd share with you some reflections that Pope Francis gives to us in his encyclical letter entitled Fratelli Tutti, published on the 3rd of October in 2020. And he's looking at real issues of human life and inviting all of us, all people of goodwill. He reminds us in chapter 4 that Francis did not wage a war aimed at imposing doctrines. He simply spread the love of God. He understood that God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God. That's a direct quote from 1 John 4:16. And this is the basis, Pope Francis reminds us, that inspires a vision of fraternity in our midst today. And in fact, Pope Francis goes on to speak of hope. And in chapter 55, he says that hope speaks of us of something deeply rooted in every human heart, independently of our circumstances and historical conditioning. Hope speaks to us as a thirst, an aspiration, a longing for a life of fulfillment, a desire to achieve great things that fill our heart and lift our spirit to the lofty realities like truth, goodness, beauty, justice, and love. Hope is bold. It can look beyond personal convenience, the petty securities and compensations which limit our horizon. Hope can open us up to the grand ideals that make life more beautiful and worthwhile. And then he continues with a reflection on the Good Samaritan parable. And I think that this parable is very touching because it's a challenge. It's a challenge that our Lord gives to us in thinking about our neighbor. Francis in chapter 69 says, "The parable is clear and straightforward, yet it also evokes the interior struggle that each of us experiences as we gradually come to know ourselves through our relationships with our brothers and sisters. Sooner or later, we all encounter a person who is suffering. Today, there are more and more of them. The decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. Each day we have to decide whether to be good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. And if we extend our gaze to the history of our own lives and that of the entire world, all of us are or have been like each of the characters in the parable. All of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passerby, something of the Good Samaritan. So indeed, when we hear this challenge of how to be neighbor, this challenge of how to really reach out in fraternal solidarity, it's so important. And really, I think that by inculcating, by challenging through theological reflection, through engaging in concrete ministry at the edges of society today, all of this, driven through prayer, aided by our reason and reflection, will enable us truly to support our brother and sister. As a closing thought, I wanted to end with Pope Francis's chapter 107 from Fratelli Tutti. And I think that this quote sort of sums up how I believe that we allow the Spirit to guide our students in responding to the needs. Francis says, "Every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally. This fundamental right cannot be denied by any country. People have this right even if they are unproductive or were born with or developed limitations. This does not detract from their great dignity as human persons, a dignity based not on circumstances, but on the intrinsic worth of their being. Unless this principle is upheld, there will be no future either for fraternity or for the survival of humanity." So for me, it's quite simple. The basic gospel truths compel us to witness into our society.
Thank you so very much. A story of your own parents and Ukrainian background, witnessing the faith, the power of prayer, and lifting up Fratelli Tutti as an example and a guide in many ways to formation and engagement with public life. Very powerful. I would like now to invite the panelists to raise a question for each other, and then we will turn to the questions that have arisen from our audience. So panelists, I invite you to jump in.
I'll lead off.
Okay.
Bishop Budde.
Yes.
Thank each of you all for sharing. I have been made wiser from this experience thus far. how does your institution or community of faith engage what I alluded to earlier as Dr. John Kinney's perspective on scholar, being that of convergent, or one that welcomes the corner scholar or the community sage and advocate for justice in a local context? How does your institution, or how does your community of faith engage that person into the discourse of theological education and social activism and public life? Is there space provided in which those who serve, for lack of a better word, in the trenches and on the edges of society, enthralled by the reality that we seek to address? Is there such space for them to offer their witness?
Wow, Dr. Howard, that's a very exhortational question. And I would say, you know, as a point of reference, I oversee 86 churches of various sizes and contexts. And in some instances, there is great space for that, because there are people of those very trenches that you describe who are rising leaders within those congregations, and sometimes called then from those congregations into greater service and ordained life. If I were to critique the Episcopal Church, I would say that we have far too few opportunities, and that would be a sign of our increased faithfulness, that those avenues were more widely and fruitfully populated. I will say that there are some populations that have found themselves in the Episcopal Church and in our theological studies in different theological contexts that bring that passion. But as one of the questions that has come to us from those who are listening to our reflection has alluded, there is a widening gap between us as religious institutions and religious leaders with those struggles and those who have found our witness less than compelling. And those are some of the questions that keep me up at night in wondering how I might respond in faithfulness. So thank you.
Dr. Howard, if I may, I'm glad you brought up the corner theologian. Mm-hmm. I love that image, and it really struck me, and I just was wondering, in a sense of in your own experiences, and how do you find that corner theologian impacting how you teach and how you preach?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Mariann, for the response. That language is that which I borrow or glean from Dr. John Kinney, former dean, but yet it's very much a very real existence within all of our communities and contexts. But for far too long, as Mariann alluded to, we have not welcomed, invited, or been as intentional as we ought to have been, and sitting in the presence of those sages and those wisdom holders who have a keener lens to certain struggles that we might very well still be at a distance from, no matter how many times we plant our feet, within other person's challenged worlds. There are those who are there. And so therefore, we try to be, or I try to be, and I know other communities try to invite, more so in recent days, persons to the table to not only strategize and plan out practical ministry, but similar to the work of the collaborative that is being done by way of the management of in-trust that the 6 HBTIs are part of, and that is bringing such persons to the table to inform the academy what more, in fact, we can do to better prepare faith leaders to serve them. So therefore, in many ways, they're playing a real role in shaping the substantive as well. At the end of the day, I take into account that that all of us, as we have all exclaimed tonight, are valued. That our elders and even the most tender in age and our wisdom holders and sharers, if we are willing to approach them as valued voices. But I'm challenged to continue to do so in my own little world, but also encouraging others so that we can have a greater reach throughout the entire world, and bringing such gifts to the table that will better all of our existence.
Thank you so much. That's really beautiful.
Thank you very much, panelists. Was there another follow-up question?
No, I'll stop there, let others in.
Okay, we might come back to it depending on the questions that we get from our participants. I do want to encourage participants to share a question, and you can use the chat feature, evidently, if you wish. Just make sure it says panelists and attendees, or the Q&A feature on the far right. We do have some questions that have been risen from the audience. One is a comment that makes me want to issue a question from, and it's a comment lifting up professors that this student has encountered, especially at your school, Dr. Howard. And I wanted to ask each of you, I know that Bishop Budde mentioned sermons of Martin Luther King Jr. as deeply influential, but along the lines of the kind of mentors that and the practical teaching, the teachers who light up scripture and the like. Who's been a mentor for you in your theological growth? And that's for all three of you. Yeah.
I'll start, and I'll say that many people on the level of corner theologians, I would say that, and I'm thinking especially those who formed me in my really pivotal years, the years of my 20s, early 30s, it was the example of the martyrs of Central America. I happen to I was wired into that for reasons that have to do with my history and study, but I was just blown away by their faithfulness and their courage. And I wanted to be like them. I just wanted to be like them. Also, I happened to be living on the Arizona-Mexico border, and the people who were involved in that same era in the sanctuary movement of that time were mentors to me in a profound practical way, putting their faith on the line, helping to really live a faith that was, I'm not sure if it was theologically sophisticated, but it was grounded in their faith and in their commitment to justice. When I got to seminary and in my studies since then, I would add voices like Walter Brueggemann, someone who's been very influential to my thinking along these lines. Many of the liberation theologians, and more James Cone in the African-American tradition. So there's no shortage of people once you start opening yourselves up to this. I think the interesting question for me is, what's the spark that stirs the hunger that moves the process forward? And so, I go back to my own formative years and very curious as to how others experience that as well.
So as I reflect on the question myself, Larry, I mean, the first image that really came to my mind, and when I think about theology, was my own grandmother, and her praying, and it was an image when I was just maybe 5 years old or 6 years old, and she's praying, and she's just sitting there and meditating in prayer, and I'm running around while she's praying, and I was just doing my own thing, and I think that that in a real encounter with God, that there have been numerous saints in my life like that, who have impacted me. And it's funny for me, sometimes it comes in the oddest places. I have fond memories of praying with people in hospital rooms, that that they really challenged me to think about what my own life was about, where I was going. Other engagements with classmates, much like Her Excellency Bishop Budde, I as well was a seminarian here, and I benefited from the Washington Theological Consortium, and so from numerous theologians that I read at the time, including Karl Rahner and Skilebix, and some of these classical ones that sort of made me just sort of rethink things to my classmates that I met, Lutheran friends that I have to this day, that helped me to see beyond and to engage. And then certainly, in my work now, I'm humbled in my engagement to read the works of my own fellow colleagues, and the questions that they try to raise, from the minute details in history to the penetrating questions that we face today, and trying to bring answers, and trying to keep alive, especially as we celebrate Pentecost, this operation of the Spirit in our midst.
Thank you.
Father Mark, you have invoked fond memories for me tonight, because similar to your story, that is a part of my personal witness. My grandmother, who I mentioned earlier, but my mother, as a young boy, seeing her gaze out the window of the back door and moving her lips, but I heard no sound. And I asked her, prior to me starting formal education, I was about 4, maybe 5 years old, and I recall asking her, who was she talking to? And that is when I remember my catechism beginning, or her shaping, along with my father, in the faith, and in particular the significance and the power and the necessity for prayer. I have no idea what she was praying for, but I remember that moment. So thank you for causing me to smile within my own spirit. So there are those, such as mothers and fathers and local members of or members of the local congregational setting or parish that I was a part of in my early years. But also, as I matured, I started to read more, and that reading continues, from King to Thurman, as you mentioned, Mariann, and yes, being introduced to Skilebix while at Aquinas Institute still has, for me, fuel that have yet to expire. But my wisdom community has no boundaries. It's within the academy and it's on the street corner. It's within the pew and those whom I'm privileged to share the pulpit with. My pastor was my advisor as an undergraduate religious studies major at Virginia Union, Angelo Chapman, who is still my pastor, and offered unto me the gift of embracing your humanity along this journey of discovery of greater call and purpose. the likes of Katie Cannon and Patricia Gould Champ and John Kinney and Jeremiah Wright. These individuals have influenced my voice in that of being conscious and prophetic. But I am still awaiting a lesson to be learned by me, by someone else within this wisdom community that, again, for me, has no boundaries.
Thank you so much, all three of you. There is a question here about how do we prepare students to face the reality of a culture that's increasingly skeptical about the value of voices of faith in public dialogue?
Well, I would guess the students would be made of stone if they didn't know that already, right? And so just to put it out there, and I don't know that there is any antidote to skepticism except authenticity and persistence and witness, right? So it's, yeah, it's a tough time, but there are people who shine through with brilliance and passion and tenacity. And I guess I would say to ask students, as well as the question I ask myself, you know, which side of the evolutionary spiritual cycle do you want to be on? You know, do you want to be on the side of life and hope? Well, then you're in the game. And whether you're successful or not isn't nearly as important as the daily commitment to faithfulness. But again, that's why I think examples are so important, to have people who inspire us, and also the events and the opportunities that teach us what it feels like to be in the game, because it can get very heady if you're not you know, and several of us have talked about the balance between theological study and action, parish ministry, and, you know, life in the streets. I mean, there's no substitute for just jumping in, right? That's what I would say.
Thank you. Others?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, that's really a key, you know, just sort of witnessing. You know, it's an engagement. I mean, I can remember even, you know, 25, 30 years ago when I was a seminarian, and, you know, we were facing some of the same issues of, you know, where is the respect, where is the engagement? I think, though, that for me, and why I chose to meditate a little bit on Fratelli Tutti and pick out that image of the Good Samaritan, because I really think it's prophetic. You know, how much do we really know about our neighbors? You know, we may never have met a, you know, person of the Sikh faith before. You know, do we seek to engage and to learn? Do we seek to see them for who they are? And I think that the best antidote that we as Christians can provide is to really live our faith completely, engage with the other, and give that witness. All too often, you know, I as a Catholic now, I get tired of this public ridicule of Catholics and Catholic guilt. You know, it's just presumed that Catholic guilt is what Catholics do. Well, no, guilt is meant to lead us to reconciliation, which leads to forgiveness, which leads to the right relationship. You know, but we can't be shrinking violets in all this. We've got to manifest that, you know, hey, we're happy. You know, there's some days that it's not right, and there's some days that it's bad, but, you know, on the whole, if we have people who are engaged and alive, people are drawn to life. But if we have people and we haven't confronted the sinfulness that keeps us bound and keeps others bound and diminishes the dignity and the light in the other person, and forgets to love the sinner despite or even because of the sin, you know, and that this is a you know, a real problem today, to really encounter and say, well, yeah, you know, I was wrong. I had these prejudices or these thoughts or this about that person, and I was just wrong. And I need to, you know, put myself on the right space. So for me, that's That's the type of an ethos that I think we strive to inculcate in our students, as leaders, to really be rooted in the faith, to be people of prayer, and to be self-reflective and living that faith alive.
Dean Howard, anything to add?
I'd like to say ditto. But it's interesting because when that question was raised, and I read it here in the chat, I was even pondering or wondering, is there another question behind that question? That preceded that question, because it's relative to context, and I understand from one particular landscape that a lot of individuals, let's say, for instance, historically, the Black church, from the days of the invisible institution and of the early and mid 19th century and the antebellum South unto the days of the civil rights era, has led in many ways in that of social reform, right? Institutional reform, social justice. But there's a swelling of many persons who may very well have their orientation within the Black church that has still been raising questions to the Black church. Where are you in light of, in recent years more so, the public slaying of Black and brown bodies unarmed by officers of the law? And therefore, individuals say, I see in the Black Lives Matter movement the work being done that you claim that you are about, or historically may have very well been the work that you have been doing, but it's not in this present age. Now, there are members of faith and of the Black church and white church and evangelical church and mainline church as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. But there's perceptive reality out there that it's doing this work because the historical work done and that of the Black church are fighting for justice and for the voiceless is not necessarily being done. So therefore, individuals are becoming skeptical of the value of the voice of faith in public dialogue when discussing these matters. I would hope that, as my peers have shared, that we will still live out our faith. That does not mean that we have to suit ourselves or cloak ourselves in the garments of an apologetic or defender of the faith if we are unable to do so, but to live out our faith, nevertheless, in spite of the skepticism and that which is contrary. And there will be a witness, because the minority, even I'm speaking of us as a faith, it seems, becomes holy. It becomes unlike the majority. And in the spirit of Rudolf Otto, that mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans, it then starts to terrify and attract folk. So individuals will be drawn to the faith being consistent, even in spite of opposition or skepticism, I should say.
Thank you very much. It reminds me of the question that's in some of the theological education literature about how much faculty should offer testimony, either inside or outside the classroom. And I remember one of our great Old Testament scholars that they called them that then in divinity school, the day he preached and offered all his personal testimony, it basically blew my socks off to realize that he had been through struggles of faith himself. Let's move then to a fascinating question. It's related to the framework, Bishop Budde, that you lifted up. And it's the question about, while we're here in DC, are there ways that theological schools or the consortium can better engage public leaders, secular leaders, with this kind of framework to deepen their own formation into leadership?
To engage public leaders?
Yes, right. And secular political leaders, etc.
What a great question. Well, if we work from the assumption that those catalysts are among the many ways that God is at work in a human life, I would say any opportunity we have for relationships and experiences and teaching that would, to name 3 encounters that would open that experience, I would say, yeah, it would be a. Those aren't the kinds of things that necessarily bring fast results, because you have to win trust and relationship to even begin to have the conversation. But, you know, one of the things that I've learned in public witness is that when people of faith move into that sphere, we don't have to be experts on all the issues. What we bring is our faith and our conviction that God calls us into that sphere for the common good. And as Dr. Howard was saying, that has its own compelling energy about it. And so the fact that we even care might be in itself a witness.
Others have thoughts about either this framework or another kind of framework to help public leaders be more grounded, to more deeply form the leadership that they offer the public?
Did you want to go, Dr. Howard, or I'm sort of holding back, but.
Well, you know, it has been plainly stated by Mariann, and such approach, I believe, is an obvious way, you know, and probably the most appropriate path, while yet within the institution or within the academy, we're seeking to, even by way of this new certificate that has been established, Faith in Public Life, where we offer courses in religious freedom, law and religion, ethics and politics, you know, for our seminarians, that when the seminarian is more fully equipped to engage with others within the public square or so-called secular leadership, as the question was raised, then that will play a major role in them bridging certain gaps and closing certain chasms that exist and creating more genuine partnership or relationship so that we can move together as a humanity, a people of faith and others of faith serving in those capacities, but may not necessarily have the same theological bent or conviction to carry out the work as we view it of Jesus. But will create space for them to feel more comfortable. I'm talking about the seminarian or the minister of the gospel, to engage such persons to create a more harmonious league or team to bring about the change that we seek in public life.
So as Dr. Goldman knows, this is something that he and I have chatted about many times, about what we can be doing and should be doing, and part of the consortium, the part of our theological schools. And for me, I mean, certainly as an educator, education, you know, engaging. And so those two things, and the education doesn't have to be a, you know, a formalized lecture, but, you know, just in the encounter, you know, to be out. You know, it's amazing to me how many seminarians don't engage with the community broadly. You know, they engage with where they feel comfortable, but you got to go outside of the comfort zone. And for some people, going to political rallies is outside their comfort zone. But we've got to be in that zone. We've got to be communicating. We've got to have a message that's compelling, that you know, is really rooted in that common good, and helping people to you know, go deeper and really bring about that respect for our brothers and sisters, bringing about the proper and dignified treatment. You know, to me, I think it extends, you know, to debates, to challenges, to putting on, you know, conferences, to looking at what are we doing with our public dollars. You know, this country has turned its back on psychological care for thousands of people, you know, and how do we re-engage that? How, you know, there's a lot of talk today about, well, you know, we're not going to send police into certain situations, we're going to send counselors. Well, you know, there's a whole lot that we can and should be doing to build this good society, to build this right society, and to engage in that, to communicate, and to have that dialogue that, you know, that invites them forward and moves on. I'm all for providing lectures even on Capitol Hill.
Well, I think I want to invite the three of you back to hold a symposium with policymakers and legislators around forming public leadership and building greater harmony. I think that would be a really remarkable challenge. We have reached our time. I again want to thank each of our panelists for their conversation this evening and enriching our understanding of this important issue. I also want to thank our participants for being with us. We will have a film copy of this video on our website in the near future, so share it with those who were not able to be with us. I also want to invite our participants to, well, we're definitely at our time now, as my clock is telling me. Invite our participants to join us in this anniversary celebration this year. If you would like to sponsor a student need regarding our interfaith work and our certificates of study in ecology and criminal justice and Muslim Christian dialogue or ecumenism, please visit our website to learn more about that. We will have other events coming regarding this general theme, and we invite you to stay tuned. I would like to turn it back over to Anthony Quainton for a final word.
Thank you, Larry. And thanks to all the participants. I think this is an example of what is so badly needed, the opportunity to dialogue across traditions and to realize how, as committed to the Christian message, how much we share, even when on the surface outsiders say how much we differ. And so, as so often many of us have heard at the end of Sunday worship, I would say, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.